There comes a time in every game master's life where they need to decide whether they want to run a full-fledged campaign or just a one-shot. Let's talk about those. Hey fellow game masters, I'm Richard Quiner and welcome back to the channel where today we're going to talk about the differences between a one-shot and a campaign. Super basics, super important, super easy. As you dive into one-shots and campaigns, you find that there are four main differences. First off being the length, and the most obvious. Second, you see a difference in the freedom the players can have while playing these types of stories. Fourth is the personalization, or how much of it you can make your own, or the players can make it their own. And last is the scope of the story, or how much of the world does the story affect. With those four things in mind, I'm going to be breaking them down in a lot more detail so you as a GM can decide what you want to run and what fits your personality and playstyle best. First off, we're going to dive in a little deeper with the campaign. By far the most common type of game that you find in role-playing games, it is the granddaddy, it is the big story. It's more compared to a novel. When you read a book, it has a long process. It takes a while to read usually. For me, I'm a slow reader. But you have a long story that takes place over a long period of time, whether it's several weeks or even several years. That's similar to a campaign in that it is a long, drawn-out process for you and the players. That being said, the length of a campaign can run from a matter of weeks to a matter of months, all the way up to several years on one story arc. And that's kind of the campaign. Things move a little slowly, you get into the characters more, but it moves closer to real time than the actual one-shot does. When you're doing these campaigns, the story itself is also carried on throughout the length of time, and often things can be referenced, years down the line. You can reference something that was previously mentioned a year or two earlier, and so the story fills the campaign and the entire time that you're playing it. When you think of campaigns, to get a good idea of the freedom you feel in the campaign, I want you to think of games such as Skyrim or Fallout or World of Warcraft, or these large-scale games where you as the player have a lot of freedom to go pretty much anywhere you want and do anything you want. Granted, video games are a lot more restricted because of the coding, but the idea is the same, where in a campaign, the adventure party can do whatever they want. They are not stuck on rails going from one place to the next. They do have the choice to leave and kind of go off of the beaten path that their game master has in mind. That's kind of the freedom that I mentioned earlier of the campaign, is the freedom of choice that the players have to make it their own and experience the world that you, the game master, are building for them. Oftentimes, these include, in addition to the main storyline, little side quests and side storylines that the players may choose to follow. So campaigns take a little more effort in that sense, where you have to have more for the players to do than just go from point A to point B, that you might want to have branch off into point C and D and E and so on, to have a lot of different side quests for the players to give them more options and more freedom. When doing a campaign, it's nice to have elements that make it a little personal to the players. If you remember in the Session 0 episode, I talked about having your players share some information about their characters so you can use that in the game. This comes really handy when designing a campaign because you can tie in different elements and have the player characters be really invested in what's happening in the story. And the last thing to note about campaigns is that the scope is often larger. Now, when I talk about scope, I mean more the scale or the things in the world that the story can affect. So, for example, you have an adventure party of 6 people, but their actions can affect an entire kingdom or the entire planet, depending on what they do in their campaign. When you picture large scale, think of things like Lord of the Rings or the Star Wars, where they blow up the Death Star, and it's a big scale event that really helps the world as a whole, as opposed to a small scale story, which we'll get into with the one shot, something that really just affects a small community or a small group of people. Campaigns, big scale, big time, big everything. Some of these large scale events that you might think of if you are creating your own campaign, which there will be another video coming up on how to create stories and build that. But large scale events can be things such as demons overrunning a city and trying to take over the world, or a country at war because maybe there was an assassination and they are going into a civil war and the adventure party has to figure out a way to stop it, or a magical device has been triggered and is about to blow up the world and the players have to stop it. A lot of things have to do with players stopping bad things from happening. And like all stories who have main characters and follow these main characters, it's really nice to give the main characters a nice, satisfying ending where everything is happy and good. Or even if it's not happy and good, just something that the players can really say, yeah, that's my character. That's what they would do at the end of their time in this world. Shifting gears from the campaign, I want to go into little details of the one-shot. Now, the one-shot, if you remember, I compared the campaign to a novel. The one-shot is more like a short story, something that's a couple, 2 to 3 pages. Very simple story that's has basically one kind of action or arc that can be played in one night of gaming. Now, oftentimes people say, oh, I have a one-shot, and it ends up being 2 or 3 sessions. And I say, in that case, it's not a one-shot, it's a small campaign. But that's just how I define it. Other people define it other ways. I'll call it a 2-shot if they prefer. But for me, a one-shot is one night, one story, beginning to end, with your players. That's it. That's the one-shot story. When creating a one-shot, one thing I've noticed as I've played them myself is there is a lot less freedom for the players. So this is more of the games that are on rails, where you have to go from A to B to C, and you don't get to veer off so much. So think of it more as like Call of Duty or arcade games, Pac-Man, things where it takes you from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, so on, in a very quick way, and you don't get a lot of side quests or a lot of freedom in that way to experience the world. You basically have a mission you need to complete, and the players and you as the GM need to make sure that gets completed. That's the one-shot story, is small, very contained thing. When building a one-shot, it's fun to have the story elements connect to the players in some way, but it's not necessary. One-shots are kind of more of a glimpse in the day of the life of these people, or a glimpse into the day of this character, where, like I mentioned before, the campaign, you like to tie things in and build a story around your players. A one-shot oftentimes is built so you can put almost any player in there, and they can do okay and enjoy the story. So one-shots, in my opinion, are a little more heavier lifting on the story writing and coming up with cool characters for the players to interact with, and less about giving the characters the freedom to roam around and tie in the story that way. The scope of the story, if you remember from like 5 minutes ago, I mentioned the campaign is a very large epic scale. The one-shot is more often than not a small scale event. This could be a heist, where you have to break in and steal something from home. One of my buddies recently ran a heist for a hat. We had to go steal a hat, and it was a great time, and it was really fun, but it was also very small, very contained. It could be robbing a bank. It could be retrieving going out and hunting a bounty. Just investigate a cave where weird sounds were coming from. The scope of the one-shot is not so much affecting the whole world and the world that the players are inhabiting in this time, but it's more, it affects them and one group, or them and one person, and is a much smaller scale thing. And it could or could not lead into a campaign. That's up to you and the players, but in general, it's a self-contained little adventure. I like one-shots for beginning, for the reason that if you run a one-shot and you decide you don't like being a game master, you're not committed to trying to run a whole campaign. The flip side of that is, I feel trying to run a whole campaign gives you more of a chance to experience what it is to be a game master and decide whether you like which aspects of it you do enjoy versus what you don't enjoy. So think of that as you're deciding what you're going to play. Do you want to just dip your toe in, or do you want to dive in with both feet and then decide if you like swimming or not? It's kind of like a choice you have to make as the game master, and also with your players. Like when you gather a group of players, you need to decide with them what they want to play as well, because if you say, I'm going to run a campaign, and your players we just want to play one session and see how it goes, you run into some conflict of interest, and you may not get the right cooperation that you want from your players. So, like I mentioned in the session 0, talk about what kind of game it's going to be with your players before you get started. If it's a one-shot, they'll know. If it's a campaign, they'll know, and they can agree to play or not. Now that I'm done rambling on about talking to your players, the ending of a one-shot, it should tie everything up in a neat little package, whether it's good or bad. It doesn't really leave a lot of open ends in regards to the characters that the players were interacting with. So keep that in mind also as you're creating your one-shot or deciding which one-shot you want to do. Try to make it something that the players enjoy, that they'd feel like, so the players themselves don't feel like they wasted 3 hours of game time. Like they feel like they got a good story out of it for their time. Now, I know this got a little rambly, but not too much. I tried to stay on topic quite a bit, but I hope this has helped you decide and discern the difference between a campaign and a one-shot, so you can decide which one you want to do. Let me know in the comments below which sounds more appealing to you as a new game master. Would you prefer to run a one-shot? Would you prefer to run a campaign? Thank you for watching. I've been Richard Quiner, and we'll see you next time.